Is that lore? Is that lore posted on Universe? Well, after what seems like eternity, League of Legends finally released new lore. We did get a very big story for Yorick, which was published by Riot Forge. This one serves as a little bit of a redemption for the fact that Yorick didn't appear anywhere, even in the storylines where previously Yorick was the main guy. But more importantly, Riot also gave us the story for Milio, the next champion. Of course we know that Milio is the young Ishtali mage, and since we got his story before he was technically revealed, that means he is right behind the corner, so he's gonna be on PBE very soon. Regardless, normally when I cover these stories I disappear off screen, I retell the entire story and then I end the video. But since the last time we got new lore, I did change the format of this channel a little bit. So I thought, why don't I make this video more interesting as well? And so, I'm gonna cover Emilios Story in the new way, with me being on screen. So without further ado, let's get on it! Emilios Story immediately begins in a really interesting way. Instead of just focusing on who Milio is and what he is doing, we first get a little bit of history from his family and Ishtal. It starts with Milio's grandmother, Lupe, and her twin sister, Lune. The two were elemental masters, where Lupe mastered earth and Lune mastered fire. Now, before the main story of Ishtal can get a bit confusing, let's cover what the entire region is about before we go further. At this point you may know that Ishtal is the region that isolated itself from the rest of the world using massive walls of plants. That's because in the past it seemed like the void was gonna spread around and consume everything. But there is a lot more to this region besides them believing the rest of the world is dead. Ishtal is a region that is fully focused on mastery over elements. At the center of the region you have Ishaokan, the capital city, inside which you have the high throne called Yuntal. If one wants to join Yuntal, they have to become an elemental master by overcoming the challenges of the Vidalion. The Vidalion is an ancient artifact that can weave magic into physical objects. So the way you overcome its challenge is by using it to weave yourself elemental robes. That is precisely what you can see in this picture. You do this by demonstrating full control over your axiom, or in other words, your elemental mastery. You got all of this? Good, it will be referenced in the video. Anyway, back to Lupe and Lune, who mastered earth and fire. Both of them overcame the Vidalion and they both joined Yuntal. However, that's where we learn that Lune started plotting against Yuntal. The story never revealed what she did, so we don't know if she was actually evil or if she only seemed to be evil in the eyes of Yuntal. Regardless, after her plotting was discovered, both sisters were convicted of the crime and they were punished as twins. Lupe, Milio's grandmother, was exiled to a far corner of Ishtal, while Lune, the one who actually committed the crime, simply vanished. When Milio was born, his family already had a pretty bad life, so all they could do was to make the best out of it, which is how Milio grew surrounded by love and laughter. When Milio was old enough, Lupe tried to teach him the Axiomata. In other words, all the arts of mastering different elements. She mostly did this because she wanted to save her own reputation. After all, she was exiled because of her twin. And so far, nobody else in their entire family was able to do any reasonable mastering of any of the elements. But while everyone else failed, Milio showed promise, as he naturally started grasping the elements. However, he ultimately couldn't grasp the rules and the discipline, which is why ultimately Lupe got disappointed and she abandoned all his teachings. After which, Milio did what everyone should do in their lives. He started learning the best way possible. On his own. He abandoned all the restrictions imposed by his grandmother, studying nature itself in his own way. And soon, with his own set of rules, he eventually mastered fire, which is the only axiom his grandmother never taught him. This is something the story never tells you because you're supposed to connect the dots yourselves, but the likely reason why Lupe never taught him about fire is because fire was mastered by her twin. And naturally, since she lost her trust in Lune, she would most likely distrust the mastery of fire in general. Anyway, one night when Milio was chasing a firefly, he found an injured hunter in the jungles. At first, he made her stable using his axiom, but the village's healer was far away, so he had to do more. Which is when he desperately adapted his axiom into a force that could heal. And just like that, he used his axiom to touch her soul, which he referred to as the inner flame. After this incident, Milio noticed the same kind of warmth in all objects all around him. Focusing all of his energy into this feeling of warmth, he managed to manifest his inner flame, which is how he spawned a new friendly creature. These are all the goopy friends that were teased the first time we heard about Milio. Milio then took this creature and he placed it onto the hunter's wound, after which it started healing her from the inside out. That night, Milio discovered an entire new axiom, which he named Soothing Fire. After this, Milio ran back to his village so joyous that he spawned another one of these soothing flames. And of course, the entire village celebrated this occasion. And Milio named his fiery friends Fumingos. But while everyone was celebrating, Lupe was unsettled. Again, it is not mentioned anywhere in the story, but it is most likely because fire was mastered by her twin. And soon, Lupe grew troubled by the fact that Milio was fascinated by fire. And she didn't like how his burgeoning skills went against all teachings of the axioms. But she still appreciated that her grandson achieved something which the rest of the family couldn't. And with his abilities, he could finally end their exile and return them to their rightful place in the capital. And so, Lupe threw everything into her last chance at redemption. From that point, Milio became her sole focus. She started preparing him to leave home, travel to Ishaokan, and finally free her from her sister's failures. However, Milio felt the weight on his shoulders, and the idea of leaving home terrified him. But because Milio loved his family above everything else, he would find the courage if it meant to bring everyone happiness. During their preparations, Lupe made him a special backpack which Milio called Fernista. It's the massive pale thing which you can see on his back. And it was made to carry all his burning fumingos with him. And so, with a smile on his face at only 12 years old, Milio put on the new clothes made by his family and he left the village. He traveled the entirety of Ishtal, forging his way through the jungles, camping underneath the stars, making new friends along the way, all while sending letters back home. After the long journey, Milio finally arrived in Ishaokan. There he became known as the boy with the soothing flame, and his presence caught the attention of everyone, including Lune, who, this entire time, was imprisoned underneath the city. And this is where the story ends. It is a fairly standard story that feels a bit like a setup. Now, when it comes to setup, we got burned in the past, so don't get too excited about that one. But what I like about this story is that Riot is actually trying to do something new. Because for the color story, which usually is a massive wall of text, this time we got Milios Letters, which are these pieces of wood, which is pretty funny. But these letters function as a bit more interesting version of the normal walls of text. Which, to be fair, they also have a bit of text with them. But the point is, the first letter shows us Milio the moment he left the village. The contents of the letter are pretty much a kid writing home to their parents. He asks about how everyone is doing, he name drops all the relatives, and he talks about how he arrived at the next village, how he's happy that he can finally sleep in a bed. He mentioned that his fumingos are doing well, and he tells Lupe that he keeps practicing his axiom every day. And he also mentions that he's doing really well, but he's really hungry. And that's really where the first letter ends. Now next there are 4 other letters, but those don't have a description. And I believe, hopefully, we will get them later. Right now, on Universe, it is said that there are more letters to follow. It is definitely possible that originally we were not even supposed to see the pictures. I think those were supposed to be hidden as well, but it kinda just happened to be there anyway. So yeah, let's just pretend that this is an accidental leak. Regardless, I wouldn't be surprised if the plan was that every week or so, up until Milio's release, we might get another one of these letters revealed. So I assume there is gonna be more text. Which again, I have to say, is a really interesting way to tackle a champion's story. But of course, because probably on accident we already saw the other letters, let's talk about what we can see in the pictures. On the next stop, Milio is going to meet Nidalee. In this picture you can see that we can also see two of her other cat family members and one other tribesman. I assume we will learn about their identity in the letter. Also, this is definitely the reason why Nidalee got new voice lines. It's because they could actually tie her into the new champions. So yes, in case you don't know, in the new voice lines for Nidalee, she talks about both Milio and Naafiri, which is the future Darkin champion. The next letter after that shows us Milio and how he's healing people using his flame. What's interesting is that for three of them you can see their faces, and the last one... The next stop is Nico. Of course, this makes sense because we know that Nico and Nidalee spend some time together, so they should still be in somewhat of a close proximity. But besides Nico and her froggy friend, you can also see the thorns. These could be just random parts of the jungle, but they could also be Zyra. Remember, a little bit more to the north, that's where Zyra is slowly taking over the jungles. And these thorny vines could be that. Also, in the background you can see that the mountain seems to have a little bit of a face. Now, even though Legends of Runeterra is trying to convince us that Malphite is around Targon, in reality he is around Ishtal. Because in his latest story, Piltovans actually found him underneath the ground there. So who knows, maybe this is hinting that Milio got to meet Malphite. And the last letter shows us the moment Milio gets into Ishaukan, since the building he is standing on matches the design of the capital. But that's pretty much it. What I really love about Milio's story is that it is shorter and digestible, while also giving us some really cool lore bits, such as the history of his grandmother with her twin, which also seems to be a little bit of a setup, but these days I'm still skeptical about more setups. I also want to mention that it is really cool that Milio is gonna tackle the Vidalian, which technically means that if he succeeds, he should get his own elemental robes, which are different from what you can see in his splash art. The story specifically mentioned that his clothing was made by his family. So just like Silas got a Freljordian skin to reflect what happened in the story, it would be really cool if Milio actually got a skin of him wearing the robes of the Vidalian. But that's probably just wishful thinking. Just like the fact that I hope we will finally learn what's happening to Qiyana. In case you don't know, many times Riot confirmed that Qiyana is doing something in the background, which is why she didn't help anyone during the ruination. But we never got to learn what she was actually doing. So here's more wishful thinking. Lastly, we can mention that, gosh darn it, the music is really good. But that's kinda a given. At this point everyone knows that Riot's music is beautiful, and yet again, in that way they did not surprise. So yeah, here's Milio, the first champion in a while that actually seems to be getting people excited. That could be because Milio is not connected to anything else that will be dragging him down. And since in this case less lore could be more, I am fairly happy with him so far. And hopefully Riot is gonna carry this momentum forward. Which brings me to another thing. Remember how in the past Riot released Zeri and Neon in Valorant together as a single package? I noticed that in Valorant we are also getting a new agent who is throwing his goopy friends around. Is this Milio after puberty?